If I miss anything, please grab my attention and let me know. So we're here for the regular meeting of the Infrastructure Enterprise and Utility Oversight Committee, scheduled to go from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. today. And with that, I'll go ahead and start with member introductions.
Mark Littlefield.
Karen Braga.
Scott Myers.
Anna Brawley.
Zach Johnson.
Felix Rivera.
And then we have member Martinez, you're on the phone.
Yes, thank you, sir.
All right, and then Chair Constant was here but stepped out momentarily. And I think for introductions over here, we'll just take them as we get to each piece. So right now, queued up, first we have a presentation on the PAMP. I think, Eric, that's you. Yep. If you want to introduce yourself and take it away.
Yes, thank you. My name is Eric Adams. I'm the Jacobs Program Manager for the Port of Alaska Modernization Program. I'm here on the behalf of an AO that was issued number 2024-103 back in November, asking to explain the necessary components to achieve parity between cargo terminals 1 and 2. Next slide, please. And so in that AO 2024-103, there's 3 asks of us. Kind of talk high-level design components, recommended timing, and estimated cost for this. So that's what I'll be covering today. Next slide, please. So the design components to achieve parity between Cargo Terminal 1 and Terminal 2 to be constructed to allow roll-on, roll-off to operate on a new Cargo Terminal 1. This requires adding 2 additional trestles aligned specifically to tow's port side trailer truck access portals and associated wharf interfaces, abutments, approach slabs, ground improvements, and paved truck access lanes. Those are the main design components that will have to go into this. I can go into greater details, but this is a high level one there. Next slide, please. So this is just a graphical representation. Right now, on the far left-hand side is the south trestle that we have for T1, and then on the far right will be the north trestle that's currently planned for Terminal 1. If we need to add the 2 additional trestles, I just kind of put an arrow in there showing where they go, approximately this location. I think this is actually a couple inches off, but we'd have to firm this up with tote during the design of adding these additional ones in. But this is what it looked like, general location of adding those 2 additional trestles there. Any questions on that graph? Okay.
Yeah, Member Brawley has a question on this.
Yeah, thanks. And if you're going to cover it later, that's fine too. So I know we talked about parity and why that's important and making sure that both of the major users there could utilize that and in the future, any other users. Let's say hypothetically, 10 years from now, we got the terminals built, great. We have not yet built the trestles. And then Tote says, and I see Art in the back, so I'm just saying hypothetically, says we're not going to use that type of ship anymore, so that there's maybe not an operational need for these. Are we committing to build these at all costs, or is it really part of the possible things we could build?
Through the chair, Member Brawley, it's of course up to the policymakers, right? But I do have a recommendation at the end that this is just showing you what the cost would look like and the timelines, and there'd be other items that we'd have to do, right? But I think we're going to recommend that decision be made later down the road, like at 2029, 2030 timeframe is a recommendation you're going to see.
Okay, thanks. And sorry for jumping your proposal.
No, and if I might add one thing, the chair to Member Brawley. So the framework for this, right, was that we came to this body with the width change in T2, and the ask was to say, what would we hypothetically have to do if we wanted to consider that option? And so there's also there's an AIM that accompanies this presentation that will be on the addendum for next week's assembly meeting. And I would say, again, Mr. Adams will get to the recommendation, which is that there is a way to do this after the completion of the cargo terminals project as it is currently permitted and planned, that we can consider as an add-on if we decide as we get through this that it is actually the best decision for the PAMP to have this addition be part of the end plan. So I'll turn back to Mr. Adams.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. So recommended timing there is the least impactful time to implement is after construction of the new Cargo Terminal 2. So that's way in the future. Approximately 2033 is now that we're looking at that being completed. Currently, T1 and T2 are being permitted as one project. Permits are expected this spring. The final MARAD EA is expected in December of this year. And then the additional of 2 trestles now would most likely delay the start of T1 construction if you guys voted, came back and told me I need to put it in now. So my recommendation would be against that. And so it's basically after the construction has been completed after T2 and other decisions are made. So in the future. Next slide, please. Want to point out one of the potential conflicts that you guys have heard that we've been talking about. The port and the MOA are currently considering adding fuel transfer capability to T1. The fuel transfer capability may conflict with TOTE's railroad operations. It's not finalized yet. That alternate fuel is still in a feasibility study. We have a lot of comments from the users that we're addressing, from petroleum users, from the cargo users, but that would have to be taken into consideration of the design. We don't have that alternate fuel completed yet, so I don't know all the design impacts that it would take to add those 2 additional trestles in the future. Both options, as I mentioned, are in the feasibility stage. And then in the future, comparative evaluation in the future may be necessary to determine which capability to add, the alternate fuels or the railroad, or if we can accommodate both. And we're looking at those right now. The main thing here is we're looking at, cost control and schedule control, be good stewards of the public's money. Next slide, please. Estimated cost. I do want to point out we did use the designer of records T1 estimated cost for this to implement those 2 additional trestles in the future. With inflation and all that is about $140 million. Assumes construction in 2033, 2034 after cargo terminal 2. So basically the first year we'd have to do the ground improvements, shoreside stabilizations. And then the second year in 2034, we'd add the trestles, and that would be ongoing at the same time as the petroleum terminal construction and those items, which is the next phase of the program. Estimated cost does exclude design and permitting costs. The permits would basically have to be amended. The ones that we're getting now, it's not a large cost there. And we basically have the standard design for those trestles. So there'd just be a small incremental cost there. And the cost, like I mentioned, is based on the cargo terminal 1 cost estimate. And we use those trestle costs the designer record gave to extrapolate to get the 140 million. Next slide, please. Any questions?
Member Constant?
Yeah, I have a few. First, I'd love to hear from Tote on their thoughts on this. Put you on the spot, guys. Come on forward if you don't mind. Just hit the green button there, or there you go. So just a question of your thoughts on the kind of framework they just put forward and the
So my name is Art Darlene, Vice President and Alaska General Manager for Tote Maritime Alaska. The findings aren't surprising to me in that at the original design advisory board, when we discussed the width of terminal or finalizing terminal 1 and then talking about terminal 2 in the future, it was presented that adding the trestles at that time would jeopardize permitting and potentially the schedule of the overall project. So at that point, the design advisory board opted unanimously to look at those in the future. So that being said, our position hasn't changed. We wouldn't advocate to delay the project to redo the permits to add these trestles now.
your thoughts on the trestles in general.
I think, in general, as presented, to have full parity for, having backup for each user, it would be incomplete without those. That being said, once terminal 2 is completed, I think, we get to that state where we're feeling good about food security, about serving the state, that we could have that conversation on the trestles at that point. But the overall point is valid.
Okay, thank you. That I would, maybe you want to go away because I'm gonna get a little spicy now. This is not about you. Yeah.
Can I ask something quickly of Art while he's up here then? And sorry not to
That's fair.
usurp you, Chris. So you said you're not advocating for a delay. Now I understand those trestles, if they're in there, that's something that your ships would utilize. Just in a hypothetical world, if they were there, would they be a benefit in your normal operations? Or are we talking about that's really just a backup in play in case T2 was somehow rendered inoperational for a period of time? Or I mean, I guess the question is this an emergency, potential use, or would it be a daily benefit were they there?
The latter. So, well, During T1 construction, we'll continue to operate at Terminal 3. Once Terminal 2 is constructed, TOTE would operate at Terminal 2. The trestles at T1 would be utilized if T2 would be inoperable, or during construction of Terminal 2 if Terminal 3 became inoperable.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. So, yeah, Art, this is not about you really. Over the years, we were sold what I would call a bill of goods that said, we need to have 2 terminals that operate in case one goes down. We can't be without a terminal. But what was really meant was, we can't be without 2 lift-on, lift-off terminals. That's what's really meant by all of this. It's really clear and plain to see by all the plans that have been, and that will, according to this, be, in my opinion, because after 25 years plus the 20 years of failed plans, no one's going to have the appetite to reopen the question in 15 years when it's all done. Forget about it. And so what we have done in our plan is, and this AM that's coming will just really reinforce this, is say there's one user or one user type that we prefer, and at the end of the world does come, we're going to have one terminal and it serves them, you're out of luck. And so that to me is the fatal flaw of this whole thing, is our failure to understand the impacts over time. Now, there was a previous administration with some of the same people who really did grasp the concept of cost causer and cost payer. And then over the intervening time, there was a shift. And so now TOTE will be paying for Matson's benefit for ever, really, and never receiving the benefit of it. And I just don't understand how that is rational or reasonable or right to do. And so our whole plan of finance, I look forward to getting into that conversation, because it feels like we're taking money from one operator, making it less competitive, making it harder for them to compete in the world of business out there, to the major benefit of the other party who won the game all along the way, who had lobbyists in Don Young's office when I was there, who I can't say what lobbying they did here because they didn't register. I feel a lot of feelings about our failure. What I think we should also do is get closer to the cost and bake into this plan, not a permitted construction, but a funded trestle project that's in the plan of finance, so that we don't promise a day that will never come, that we don't charge these people in this operation for the next 50 years to pay for this operation that they will never ever see the benefit of. Because or again, as I have said before, and I'll say it on the record now, I think that TOTE ought to consider operationalizing a lift-on, lift-off ship that they bring up to this market and start selling goods here. Because that's the only way that they will see any value on the investment that they're being forced to make over time. Because they're paying for those cranes and that maybe not the cranes per se, because that agreement is somewhat separate, but the widened berth and the extension of all of that onto theirs. And so I guess there is a way for TOTE to compete, and that's to cut into the business of their competitor using their tools. And I think it would be warranted if they did, by the way this whole process has gone. So I will step off my soapbox just to say that I believe in fairness, and I just don't believe we have achieved fairness. Thank you.
I remember Brawley.
Yeah, thanks. Just briefly, I'll say I have some different perspective or takes on kind of how to read the competition versus cooperation. But setting all that aside, I do think we should. I guess the ask is, as we talk about the plan of finance, let us know what the options are for building these potential future phases into the project. And then I guess I will say I'm not as interested in us committing to fund that upfront as I am in making sure that that would be part of the tariff surcharge if we go there. So that's my take. But hopefully we can cover that in the plan of finance. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Mr. Adams. Let's go ahead and cue up the next presentation on the Port Plan of Finance.
Has fully built. We're very excited to come before the Infrastructure Enterprise Oversight Committee today to talk about a reissued, revised, and expanded plan of finance for the Port of Alaska Modernization Project.
Could you guys
We-
just introduce yourselves for the record?
Sorry, I'm Bill Falsey, the Chief Administrative Officer. We want everybody to go down the line here.
Sure, I'll start. Becky Wynn Pearson, Municipal Manager.
All right. In November, we had a press conference about the status of the port, and we said at that time that we intended to publish a revised and expanded plan of finance that would reaffirm our general philosophical desire to use the cheapest sources of funds first, that would share very candidly how sources have, where grants have come from, where money has come into the program to date, and where those have been put to good use. That would show the grant opportunities that we are aware of and that we are going to be chasing, that would affirm our commitment to do any Port of Alaska modernization surcharges on a commercially reasonable timeline, and that maybe for the first time would very candidly lay out what happens if we don't get additional federal or state support. How do we actually deliver these projects? And so we have circulated over email, and I understand there are a few copies in the room, this working draft of our new comprehensive plan of finance that aims to deliver on those promises. And I'll say generally, why did we do this? One reason is just because our general disposition is always to play the cards face up. I think the administration just values transparency as a matter of public process. This is a very large public project. This is involving a lot of public funds. But also because by approaching the project this way, we are welcoming and soliciting feedback. I mean, this is a project where we will benefit from the input of all the best minds who are affected by this. And because we know that some of our ultimate asks of the state and the federal government will have to be informed by what the no action alternative is for them. And so we wanted to put this all in one place. The document, all told with appendices, is over 40 pages long. It is not my intent today to walk through all 40 of those pages, but rather to plant this seed and then maybe loop back to you in future meetings if you have additional questions, but rather today to do a quick highlight, tour of the document. So if you turn in your hymnals to the table of contents, you'll see that the document is now structured like this. First, we have a section that just outlines general background on the port. That's a story that is now well familiar to you, but I think is an important set piece for anyone who's using this document. The second section then outlines how this is the comprehensive plan of finance and philosophically that we are using the cheapest sources of funds first. And then because we want this to be a repository of the whole program's history, the next sections all take up the individual components of the Port of Alaska Modernization Project. The first three are done or nearly done, and they will show what the actual costs were and how we actually paid for them on a cash flow basis. The meat of the document now, because of where we are in the chronology, is section 5C, where we're addressing the cargo terminals. And then we have the remaining pieces that are yet to come. It ends with a punchline that this is a living document and needs to be publicly available on the website. And then we have a number of appendices to address topics I think are important to this program, but may not have been previously collected all in one place. So the first was, as we promised in November, we wanted to lay out all of the grant opportunities that we are aware of so that folks know that we're aware of them, but also can inform us if we have missed any. Second, we are addressing the MERAD funds, and I'll say more about that in a minute. Third, behind the curtain, there has been a chart that has been always very helpful to me that I don't know has been publicly published very often or maybe ever, but we wanted to put that in here as Appendix 3, where it is a table that I will walk you through. I think is maybe the handiest one-pager for the current status of the program. And then finally, wanted to explain more about how the uniform surcharge concept actually works and how we intend to approach tariff adjustments in future years. That's the overall structure of the document, and then I'll step through and give you some highlights. So for those first portions where we were going phase by phase, for the phases that are already done, each of them will have a table that looks something like this. This is for the petroleum cement terminal, and you'll see that the way it is structured is that we tell you the total all-in costs, which were program management, planning, design, and construction, and all of the funding sources that actually met those costs. And so each of those is going to start local, then federal, then state. Because those are in the past, we can do those with fine particularity. This is the Appendix 3 that I was talking about. You can't read this on the screen, but it's similarly structured. It just gathers it all in one place. And so you'll see on the left-hand side, all of the money that we have actually newly received, like new money, which was state grants or federal grants or port equity that we've pushed into the project, or money, new revenue that we have already raised by some kind of borrowing. All of that is then programmed across the various phases of the Port of Alaska Modernization Program, which are displayed. Oh, we have a fire alarm right now. Maybe we will take a break at this exciting
Time
moment
to
and go
leave
to
the
our rally
building.
point.
The muster point is the parking lot right in front of the Denina Center. Guys demonstrated that everyone in this building, including the manager, is kind of at the whim of whatever is happening with the updates to the fire alarm system. And so, surprise. And there was a repair that apparently happened. Signs went up and then signs came down, but there was no notification to anybody in at least the assembly branch about if an improvement had actually been made or what the current status is. And so for the purposes of our fire safety system, it's still a work in progress. Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Mr. Falsey.
All right, thank you. Jumping back in then. So we were talking about Appendix 3, the overall cash flow summary. It is showing in one handy place all of the funds that came into the program and where those funds have been used so far and where they are currently programmed for the future. Among the things that this chart shows in a handy way, for instance, is that we have used or have programmed all of the existing state funds that were granted to us through 2023. The remaining of those state funds is going towards the cargo terminal construction project. Okay. I also have a note here on the MARAD litigation. We are continuing to show the $367 million that we feel sort of a remaining entitlement to, but nothing in the plan depends on actually receiving them, meaning that this program can continue without those funds being programmed. If we receive them, then they will offset some of the tariff adjustments that would otherwise need to be made. But I know that that has caused some questions both from policymakers and even from some of the potential bidders on the construction project. Does this program live or die on the success of receiving those funds? The answer is no. And hopefully by putting this all in one place, that becomes more apparent. We also include an executive summary, which is maybe the portion of this large document that will be most used, where we try to outline where the rubber really meets the road. And we have two scenarios that are presented in that executive summary. The first, and both of these scenarios relate to the current cargo dock construction project. We say that completing Terminal 1 and Terminal 2, all in program management, design, construction, oversight, et cetera, is now estimated at $1.7 billion. So where does that money come from? The two scenarios we outline are, because this is such a vital local, statewide, and nationally important facility, one scenario that is reasonable to model is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And so that is outlined there, where you see what everyone's contributions and additional federal support and additional state support would look like. That would still leave a large portion of the project to be funded by Port of Alaska revenue bonds supported by a surcharge. We want to tell people candidly what that would mean. At the very end of the project, in order to make that 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 scenario work, the surcharge on cargo would land at today's projection of $31.74. The surcharge on cement is $3. The surcharge on gasoline is 71 cents. That's in the future. That's 2023 or thereabouts, as we'll describe. And I should say that all of this comes with the caveats that all these are based on current assumptions, meaning in order to generate these numbers, you have to assume what your interest rates will be. You have to assume what your volumes across the dock are going to be. All of those will change year after year after year. So these numbers will all fluctuate as this plan is updated and kept alive. But this is the right order of magnitude based on everything we know now. Once we have those surcharges and we say this is how the story could end in 2023, we also want to make that real for people because that's a little bit up in the air. So we've continued to say, what would that look like if it affected commodities? And as we describe in the narrative, this is based on a number of simplifying assumptions, but which I think gives kind of the worst case scenario type feel, meaning when you put the surcharge on the Totes and Matsons of the world, they may or may not pass it on to the Costcos and the Walmarts of the world, who may or may not pass it on to consumers. If you assume that it is completely passed on to consumers, it may or may not be completely passed on based on weight. It may not actually be that exactly what it literally put on the scale is what changed. But if you assume all those things are true, that it's completely passed on to consumers and is passed on to consumers based on weight, these are the impacts that you could derive from the surcharge. They're not nothing, but they're also, we think, not impossible. The second scenario that we feel very obligated to show, though, is what happens if no one else comes, if we have received all of the state or federal support that we are ever going to receive. There's really, at that point, no place to go but Port of Alaska surcharge adjustments that either are going to support revenue bonds or a TIFIA loan. And we've modeled here the surcharge that results from no additional state federal funding, and you'll see that it is significantly larger. So there, by the end of the program, we would be more in the $73.87 range for cargo, $7 for cement, and $1.66 for a barrel of gasoline, which is now starting to be 4 cents on a gallon. Again, we don't think these numbers are impossible. They certainly aren't desirable. And having a shared understanding of what that looks like, I hope, informs our policymakers on all levels of government as we go forward. Those are end state numbers, and we do want to be clear about that. The central portion of the document, if you turn in your hymnals to section 5C, where we're talking about cargo, would then say, if no additional state or federal funding comes, and we need to do this all with revenue bonds supported by PAMP surcharge adjustments, from a cash flow basis, the way we could structure that would be to sell bonds every 2 years, starting in 2026, after the bonds that we just have now recently issued. There's no particular magic in that. We could sell bonds more frequently. The recommendation from public finance was that this is what would be needed and probably is the cheapest way to go on the bond issuance side, because the fewer number of issuances, the less you incur transaction costs. And so you see there that the $1.5 billion that we would have to locally raise would be raised in tranches between now and July 2023. And the surcharges would ramp up sort of along the lines of that. This is also for joint collaboration and discussion with all the affected parties. What, as a starting point, we would propose for internal purposes is that you could have the surcharges go with the bonds, meaning that you would ramp up as they are needed locally. And that's what this table looks like. Of course, you'll see there that there's jumps between 2026 and 2027, and then no adjustments in the even years. Those certainly could be smoothing. When the petroleum cement terminal was funded with dockage and wharfage adjustments, there were conversations about the desirability of not having those quantum jumps, but rather to have more linear adjustments. And so in conversations with the commercially affected parties and the assembly, we certainly could say, as a practical matter, it may make more sense for those to come online annually rather than biannually. The last appendix includes some of the other commitments that we flagged in November, where we said we wanted to put on paper that we have heard from the carriers that it is most commercially reasonable for Port of Alaska Modernization Program surcharge adjustments to come into effect on January 1st. So that will be the target that we aim for, and that it is even better if January 1st adjustments are finalized and signaled by August 31st. So we put that all there too. This is a lot to digest, and I know that everyone has only received this by email late last night and then in hard copy in real time now. So the last point I wanted to leave you with is that we are really interested in everyone's feedback, and that it is a living document. It has to be updated regularly, not just because time will move on and we will have received grants or not received grants, and market interest rates will have just adjusted and volumes will have changed, but because we want to have the involved best thinking of the whole community on this project. And our plan is to take this version, which we've labeled the work session review draft, put it into a final typeset bound volume, which will be the official version in the coming days, but really to update it on something like a quarterly, semi-annually basis. With that, I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, Member Brawley in the queue.
Yeah, first, wanted to say this is great. Maybe not great news. It's a big deal, but really great to see this laid out in a really comprehensive way. I guess I'm trying to recollect my question. Let me come back to it because it came and went.
Okay, then Member Custom.
Well, I would love to see a graphical representation on this of a phase 2C or 3, which is the addition of the trusses. So it's not lost to the memory hole.
Back to Member Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. This is something for follow-up, but I think that it's related to plan of finance, but it's more generally related to how we think of the port as an asset. And I'm wondering, what is the value of the port? Knowing, of course, we're not selling it. We have it, but I'm curious, and it's not valued the way that we would a private asset. But I'm curious, kind of, what is the general property value of that asset, and then also how does this project, which of course adds to it's a giant construction cost. What does that add to the kind of valuation? And I'll just be transparent. I'm bringing this up because there is a bill that's been introduced around a port authority. I'm curious what their anticipated fiscal note for that is, because it does say that it shall transfer that asset from the municipality as well as assets from the Matsu Borough. And so I think it'd be helpful to have a basic understanding of how we would value that asset. And again, I know that's a whole conversation that I imagine will come up at a different time. But I want to bring that up here because I think it's important to understand. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know how valuable it is. I know it is valuable. And I don't know how you would factor in the cost of this into the value of that asset. But I would love to have the answer to that by the end of this month. Thanks.
So I have a similar vein of a question and one more element to add. And I consistently hear from advocates of a port authority from both sides that, well, the munis never put anything into that. It's all been paid for by the users, tariff driven. But that's not exactly true. And so I would love for the administration to figure out a way to calculate the cost of all the executive time, the assembly time, all of the time that we apply to this question, because we'll need to extrapolate that for the context of the value in addition to the steel, the cement, the access way, the roads that lead to it, all of that. But I think one thing that's never been accounted for is all of this, including 8th floor, including everyone else. And that's not cheap. So in your context of how do we value it, please add that.
So through the chair to both of the members, those are really interesting questions. I don't think that we have ever turned the crank on them before, so we'll take those away. I'll say in real time, I suspect the port has a book value now, which is just a depreciated value. And certainly that'd be one way of looking at that puzzle. Typical valuation model could also be sort of discounted cash flow basis. And the general government does receive a small dividend and MISA from the port, so you could certainly do that. But to see what we think the adjustments would be to general government in a future scenario after it's all built out. The port itself as an enterprise, of course, also has kind of a discounted cash flow. If you were to sell to a private entity, they might think of it in that regard. But again, I don't know that we've ever looked at it fully in that regard. And I guess I would also say at this moment, if to the extent that this question does seem to be recurring about who should own the port, there are a lot of things to say about that. But at the end of the day, whoever owns the port is going to inherit some version of this problem. I mean, regardless of who owns it, it's still got to be rebuilt. It still has to be funded. And there aren't a lot of alternative unicorn answers that come online if it's owned by the federal government itself or by the state, so far as we're aware.
All right, I think I had Member Brawley with a follow-up, and then we'll go back to Mr. Constant.
Yeah, just another note is we recently paid for that economic impact study. And so I think that's maybe another way to look at it. Maybe not the, as you said, the sale value, but really driving home how much economic activity depends on that port. And so again, these are going to be very timely questions. And I'd love to see the fiscal note on that bill. Thanks.
Oh, and I guess I should also say, in response to Member Constant, we certainly have poured a tremendous amount of general government effort into this program. I don't know if it counts as local assistance, but the port itself has put, as I think if you look at the Appendix 3, something like $13 million of port equity, which was sort of working capital, operating cash that it has put directly in that, of course, otherwise could have redounded to general government's benefit.
Right, but this time, assembly time, 8th floor time reading over reports, none of that is captured anywhere, and it should be captured somewhere for who knows what purpose in the future. The one thing you didn't mention when talking about the value of the depreciated asset was the real estate itself. And so the real estate is highly valuable and it's Anchorage property at this time. And so if the state is going to make a move to seize it, it must be compensating for it beyond the actual, at least that's my opinion. And I know we got really smart real estate attorneys in the room, and so I'm not one of those. And what I had heard previously in the iteration, the last bill that was trying to seize the port from Anchorage was a joint authority with the airport. And so who would end up paying for the port would be the airport, because if you look at the history of joint port authorities, airports tend to be the high value asset that bring the money, and the ports are that low value, high weight mover of goods that doesn't have the same shine. And so I think the Port of Alaska would benefit from taking some of the fat off of Ted Stevens.
All right, anyone else with questions about the plan of finance? Not, thank you all, and let's go ahead and rotate on to our next and last presentation.
All right, good morning. David Persinger, Acting General Manager, Anchorage Water and Wastewater Utility.
Mark Spafford, Deputy Municipal Manager, of which AWU is one of the departments underneath my purview. But I'll just throw out there too, the fire alarm that just happened is a really good thing that we've made some progress on recently. And I just wanted to throw that out there because one of the main people responsible for helping to get the fire alarm back up and going is we borrowed or are borrowing the AWU safety and health manager right now. And so his name's Brian Pickard. He's been helping out quite a bit with trying to get, a lot of the safety things squared away municipality wide, but specifically here at City Hall. So it's FYI.
Good afternoon. I'm Jane Pritz, the Customer Service Director for the Anchorage Water and Wastewater Utility.
I'm Eric Schmitz. I'm the IT Division Director for Anchorage Water and Wastewater Utility.
All right, so as usual with my presentations, I always want to reemphasize AWW's mission and purpose, which is to safeguard public health and the environment by providing clean, reliable water and wastewater services to our communities sustainably. And I just want to put a plug in for our utility staff. This massive windstorm that would have probably resulted in federal declarations of emergency in Florida if that happened. We went through that. There was a lot of power outages. There was a lot of debris, and of course the roads were just absolutely horrible with the slippery road conditions. But we managed to keep water and sewer services going to everybody, all of our pump stations online despite many power outages. We came through that really well, but that's a testament again to the dedication of our staff. And then one other update before I get into the main presentation. I was supposed to actually be in across the way here in the Regulatory Commission for a 2024 rate hearing. But we had actually settled that last week, and the commission put the order and vacated the hearing. So that was from the 2024 rates. Now the 2025 ones were just submitted, and that starts a whole new rate case. But the 2024 ones are settled. We got the ruling from the commission, and it was favorable to the utility. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about. There's basically two topics. One is on this privatization and relinquishment of portions of Maine as a result of changes to code through AO 2023-107. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of kind of legacy contracts that are, they're big, they've been amended many times over the years, and the reason why we're doing that and why we're coming back to the assembly. And those will be coming up probably I'm shooting for February, but they may push over into March. So this privatization relinquishes of portions of Maine. So periodically we come across these situations where there's a replat, and it's generally when they're combining lots or they're dividing lots, and you have a public sewer main that serves multiple buildings on that, for example. And I'll show a couple of examples that'll kind of pull this together. It only benefits one property. It's required to comply with both our water and wastewater tariffs. And what happens is a portion of the public main actually becomes a private service extension. These service extensions are a liability of the municipality. We don't actually own the service extensions. So these are in part a cleanup, record keeping, as well as making sure that the municipality is not on the hook for something that was transferred to a private entity. And then these are needed to be able to complete the platting action. Another question that will probably come up is, what are the economic effects of this? Are we, giving private property owners free municipal infrastructure? Well, not really, because the costs are really negligible, and it's a liability reduction. It also reduces our depreciation and our MUSA expense, and so it's really a net benefit to the municipality. Historically, we didn't require assembly action on these because they went through basically through a recording mechanism with the recorder's office. As a result of AO 2023-107, I think it's section basically section D, all of section D covers this. And so as a result of that, we'll be bringing several of these before you here in the next couple of months. And first one I'm going to use as an example is this used to be the Ernie Turner Center over at the corner of Tudor Road in Elmore. It's now the South Central Foundation Detox, and they're basically they're redoing that whole thing. They're building a new building, they're tearing buildings down. And so a very small portion of that main is actually going to be privatized. And you can kind of see through that, this drawing lays that out where this was originally was a public main that served all the way out to the existing building. With this new replat, essentially, our service or our portion of this ends at this, basically at this demarcation line, and this portion becomes private, and it'll serve their new facility. And again, this is part of a platting effort. And then there's another one. This is Tugac Electric, actually old ML&P building down here, just to the south or to the north of here. This was a legacy one where there was a sewer line that was actually in an easement underneath the building. Obviously that's impossible to maintain. they're looking at, I think, replatting and doing, maybe selling this land or doing something different. And so as part of that effort, we're vacating this easement as well as turning that portion over to the building owner. So I'll pause on that if there's any questions on these before I move to the next topic.
Yeah, a couple, I think. First, I have Member Brown.
Yeah, thanks for giving examples of this. So, generally speaking, I always am hesitant about privatization of public assets. But also I hear that there's situations where this happens. So I guess my question is, in situations like this, what if any risk is there that, say, 30 years from now, there's an issue, and then then we end up with the liability of having to deal with the fact that it is privatized?
That's a really good question. That's the reason why we're doing this is when we transfer that ownership to the private, then they take over the responsibility and maintenance of that. So if something happens in 30 years that was transferred to them, it's now their responsibility.
And I guess, though, is there scenarios where, and again, it sounds like stubs or small areas. We're not talking about a whole neighborhood or anything like that. But is there a scenario where things go real bad and we have to take this back over? I mean, I know that's a hypothetical, but just what is the risk of that?
I think the risk of that would be fairly low because again, this is, once this goes through, it goes through the recordings with the recorder's office and, it's fully transferred. Leaving these out there, and again, these are, they're serving a single property. These are where there was a public main that, like this one is, for example, where it served multiple buildings that had an easement there. We're essentially getting rid of that, turning it back over to the property. This one, they'll probably actually end up abandoning that because I think they're reconfiguring the lot. But it's a good question because, yeah, this is really a cleanup effort and to prevent us having a liability that's hanging out there that could bite us down the road.
I have two questions myself, and I'll hope they're quick. So when we privatize one of these lines, I mean, if we spent some money, hundreds of thousands of dollars to put them in, do we get any kind of recovery of those costs that we put into them?
So generally, these are, that's a good question. That kind of goes back to, the liability question. It's an exchange of liability, and there's generally not a lot of value on these at this point, and it also reduces depreciation expense. So, if these were a large, something where it was a lot of value, we'd probably look at that differently. But these are fairly discrete. There's only a handful of them a year, so, and they're, generally almost always involved with a platting effort and some sort of redevelopment.
I guess if it's a negligible value, so be it. But do you guys at least go through the exercise to try and determine a value and say, okay, if it's below this number, then we say it's negligible. But is there a scenario where we'd say it's above this number? Like say it's a newer line, we put a significant amount of public monies into it, and now it's being privatized for the benefit of, an individual party. But I guess, is there a trigger there, or are we at least kind of doing the math to look at that?
That's a good question. I'd like to get back with you on that if you mind.
Okay, thanks. I'd be curious. And then my other question, which I hope will be easier, looks like, as we've seen the examples, these are just little stubs, right? They go onto a property and they end there. Would we ever have to worry that as we look at sort of expanding the service area, that one of these little lines, there would be some plan or intention to actually, but for the fact that it's private, would have continued on to some new development, or are we pretty careful to make sure that we're not putting ourselves in that position?
No, we look at those, and there's actually, we've had those scenarios where we had a private system. A lot of the schools, for example, are a private system. And then down the road, 30 years later, we've discovered, well, we actually want to loop that line through and use it as a public main. And so we've actually converted private mains to public. So we go in, there's a process we go through to do that, to inspect it, make sure that so we can't go both ways. But generally, these are serving one lot, and they're basically, it's a small stub type thing. It's not a main line that's carrying, sewage from another property or water, to another property. It's generally serving one property.
Okay, but we're at least looking to make sure that there aren't any immediate plans for broader infrastructure that'd be impacted by any of these. Yeah,
that's correct. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so I'm going to talk. There's two upcoming contracts. The first one I'm going to talk about, and this is our customer information system. And Chris will probably appreciate this one because I think we've had some challenges with our billing interface before. So essentially, we have a customer information system, and our customer information system essentially is the database that holds all the customer information. So that, the information about every account, the premise, their billing information. This system was originally went live in 2005. It's a big software system. it's old and it's revision locked. As you know, software goes, 20 years is a pretty long timeline. We've had this on the books for quite a while, looking at replacing it, but for various reasons, the pandemic and other things delayed implementing a new CIS system. And one really key point about AWW's CIS system is that we bring in about $10 million a month in revenue, and that is used to goes into the MOA cash pool and is used to pay for expenses like labor and payroll and things like that. Because municipality collects tax payments twice a year, we get payments monthly, so that cash influx to the municipality is really good for the municipality because it reduces short-term borrowing expenses and things like that. There is an effort underway to do a new CIS system, and we've actually got an RFP in with purchasing right now to do business requirements. And so that's essentially, getting all of the details kind of behind the scenes so that we can actually put out a full-blown RFP to replace our complete customer information system. And that system has to integrate with SAP and with our work management system. So it's it's kind of a mini SAP type project, if you want to look at it that way. It's a software project. It's how we get our revenue, and it's absolutely critical to for both AWW and for the municipality. What we're asking for on this is in the the CIS replacement is probably about a 4 or 5 year effort, and that's starting in 2025, and RFP is in process. So that's our CIS system, but then we also have an interface that generates the bills. So that sends out your, the monthly bills, generates the e-bills, all of that stuff. It's basically the front end of that accesses the CIS database that presents bills and payments. And it's critical to generate bills, printing and mailing, web portal and online payments, and e-bill, payment aggregation from various sources like interactive voice response, remittance processing service, and ACH bank transfers and bill pays. And so what we're trying to do is basically bridge the gap from where we are today to getting our new CIS system in place. And so what we're looking at is amending this front end contract to give us the space to build out our new CIS system so that we can cut over to that. Some of the things that we're looking at in this amendment too is doing some improved user interface. I know, Chris, you've had a lot of challenges in the past with our, with the online bill payment and things like that. Auto pay has been a struggle, and so there's some improvements with this amendment. Really, this is a bridge to get us to a new CIS system that's in process. So now, what happens if we don't do this? Well, there's a significant implications to replace the vendor. If we were to go out and try to replace this, get a new front end for our CIS system while we're replacing CIS, it would be redundantly replacing that, because when we do a new CIS system, we'll replace the front end part of that as part of the RFP package. So what we're looking, and it would be a significant delay in time. So we're looking at and this is amendment number 11 to KUBRA, and this is, we're looking at almost $3 million increase that would give us basically an extension to 2030, which would give us the time to complete the CIS upgrade, test it all out, make sure everything works, and basically build the next system to be able to cut over, because we have to be able to continue billing and running our system throughout until we can get the new CIS up and running. So I'm going to stop on this one for now before I jump to the next one, because we're going to get into the environmental side. So question on this?
Constant.
Yeah, so the intent is to bring the system in-house in the new.
Well, I'm going to actually let Eric answer that question, because he's the director.
So is your question about the CIS system or
The new one that you're going out to get the requirements for, is it going to be a third party again, or is it going to be something that we manage internally?
So currently our CIS system is managed internally. It's running on servers over at 3000 Arctic. It's the bill presentment and
That's what I'm
payment
talking
piece
about.
that's third
Yeah.
party.
Yep.
When we went live on the new the KUBRA platform, it was a long time ago. I would say like 15 years ago, 2008. We deliberately chose a third party for that because we were able to shift all of our credit card processing out of the utility and put it on the shoulder of a vendor who's really well equipped for all of the security implications of processing credit cards and all the recurring transactions. I would imagine that when we go to replace KUBRA, we would still look for a third-party vendor just because of the implications of handling all of that PII and
So that's an
and
interesting
credit card data.
perspective. Jump in there and say that, well, MLNP had a bill system. I was able to pay MLNP. Everyone else I deal with the municipality, AWU, has an internal system to manage that. I have found this third party terrible, an absolute waste of time and energy and inefficiency and a failure of information. And I get locked out just randomly, and it's not that I'm not savvy at this. My bills are all paid and all my other utilities up to speed, and my credit score is less than 2 hands down from perfect. And so this is a bad system. And so whatever our choice was, we need to fix the bad system. And so I'm very sensitive to the idea of having it be a third party. And if it is going to be a third party, it can't be this national brokerage for government payments that doesn't give you any information, and you have to go multiple places to get it. So I do have concerns about that.
All right, thanks. We've got just a couple minutes left if you want to take us home, David.
Yeah, so the next one is our environmental monitoring contract. This is for Asplin NPDES permit. Again, I'm gonna always bring this slide up. We are 100% in compliance with our discharge permit. The only difference between Asplin and other permits is our very narrow variance on biochemical oxygen demand and total suspended solids. And so, again, I presented on this back in July, so I gave an update on the 301H, but this monitoring contract essentially, it's what does the science in the inlet. They generate a report every year that has to go to the EPA. Originally, this contract was put in place back in 2001 when we had the permit issued, and it was competitively solicited, and then we submitted a permit application because our permit expired in 2005, and since 2005 it's been administratively extended by the EPA. Now we are, as I presented a few months ago, on schedule to submit a new updated permit application as well as the biological evaluation for the Cook Inlet beluga whales here in either the late first quarter or second quarter of 2025. That's going to be a lengthy process with EPA because it's got to, go through the entire review of EPA, National Marine Fisheries Service, public involvement. So it's a lengthy time to get this permit renewal. And so we've kept amending this contract because we need consistency with this monitoring. I mean, this is, we're developing basically, this develops our, our history of our compliance with that permit, and is very vital to having consistent information. There's also not a lot of vendors up here. Kinetic Environmental is a fairly large company, and they do a lot of this type of work. They're specialized Pacific Northwest, and they have a lot of clients, both government as well as private sector. What we're looking at for Amendment 20 is, we usually come before the Assembly every year to amend this contract. Again, looking at the timelines, we're expecting this permit action to take some time. We're requesting to go out to 2028. And essentially, we're also going to put in language in there as well as when we get a new permit, we'll competitively solicit this contract for a new monitoring contract, because the new permit will more than likely have some new parameters. So that's kind of where we're at on this. This is, again, another legacy contract, and trying to be fully transparent. This is the reason why we keep extending it, is because we need to have this consistency with our information and the data that we're collecting that's being used to generate a new permit, which has, upwards of a, $1.4 billion financial liability to the municipality. That I'll take any questions.
All right, I'll just note it's 12 p.m., so let's try and keep it quick, but
Yeah.
constant.
I just actually owe you an apology that it isn't your database I have problems with. I do get locked out with my password sometimes, which is random.
Okay.
It's
Well-
it's the solid waste service one that's actually the real problem. And so I apologize. It's not your system that's the broken one.
No, but to that point, Chris, I mean, this is a 20-year-old CIS system. The Kubra was from 2007. I mean, that's 15 years old. I mean, the software has come, it changes every day, right? So the new system I believe will be much better than what we have right now.
Your friends at the solid waste utility, they need help.
All right, thank you. And on that note, it's 12:01. Let's wrap it up. I think we got one more work session starting in about 9 minutes.
Committee.
Or committee.
Yeah, it's budget and finance.
That's
Stick
right.
around.
Yeah,
Some money.
there's a thing. It'll be in about 10 minutes.
Money talks.